Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly look at the news agenda. As usual, I'm very pleased to be joined by Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, our senior fellow and royal commentator and historian. Hi, Rafe. And this week by Patrick O'Flynn, a columnist for The Spectator and former UKIP MEP. Good to see you, Patrick.
And you.
Yeah, very good. Before we talk about the week's events, just want to bring your attention to our new book. It's called State of Emergency. It's available now on Amazon. It's the third in a series we've done. You might remember The Long March, Fighting Back, and now State of Emergency. This is really what we feel should happen in order to save Britain, basically. It's a cracking read, 6-7 essays, and our pledges, which we're going to be putting to all candidates next year. So please do look that up, State of Emergency. Speaking of states of emergency and everything, we're in a state at least. Patrick, can you explain, where do we sort of stand now after this Rwanda vote that we had yesterday? We're recording this on a Wednesday. Last night we had the vote, didn't we? And the government sort of survived or, whatever. Where does it leave us?
I suppose you would say that Downing Street got the best of the expectation management game.
Right.
And the Conservative rebels got slight amounts of eggs on their face. They egg on their faces. They sort of implied they were all going to rebel, and then sort of 3 dozen of them abstained. And this was only the second reading of the bill. The real parliamentary battle will be at third reading when amendments go down in January. So Rishi Sunak has a sort of a bill in the ring, as it were, some kind of let's do something, a kind of answer to the disastrous defeat in the Supreme Court. But take a step back. Why is he in this position now? Because he didn't take any notice of Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick telling him that the illegal migration bill wasn't remotely strong enough. I think the average person is now very sceptical about the idea of a Central African country having to accept a contracted out duty to create a durable deterrent against illegal immigration to the United Kingdom. It seems to me it's highly unlikely to work. You've obviously got individual rights of appeal under this legislation. It only takes one migrant to hit on a brilliant sob story that convinces the courts, and that will become the standard template. Robert Jenrick in particular, I think, has been radicalised by this. He was Sunak's man in the Home Office. Now he seems to be lining up with the fundamentalists, that there's a fundamental issue of sovereignty, again, which you can trace back from staying out of the euro, leaving the EU. This is again about nation states controlling their borders. And I think the magical thinking is being done by the government here, with James cleverly saying we're pushing the edge of the envelope on our international obligations. Well, so what? The test is will it work? And I don't think it will. And somebody's going to have to bite the bullet on leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, which the Tories aren't looking like they're willing to do. So we're going to go into an election where stop the boats could have been this great dividing line for the Tories. Starmer is now so confident on the issue, he says, I'll pull the plug on Rwanda even if it's up and running and working. He feels no pressure. The only dividing line is straight down the middle of the Conservative Party. So disastrous politics from Sunak. He didn't strain every sinew. I think there was a poll yesterday showing 1% of the electorate thinks this bill is going to work.
Yeah. Do people actually even understand quite what the bill is, do you think?
Well, I think the problem is, of course, people are beginning to realise how few people are actually going to end up going to Rwanda in the first place. And remember, we were told originally by the Conservative government that merely the announcement of this bill would be enough to deter people from coming over here, which obviously has been shown to be completely false. I mean, this whole episode of this vote has been, I would say, the most stressful act of futility for a Prime Minister, because it's going to achieve nothing. As Patrick has said, Keir Starmer, even just yesterday on Radio 4, said that he will cancel the Rwanda plan, were he to come to office, and we all know that he is basically going to come to office, the chances of any plane taking off before the general election, I think, are next to nil. That's one of the reasons why the Tories are contemplating a spring election, because of course there's every fear that there won't be any planes going to Rwanda in the summer, and actually boats may be at a peak level during the summer. And so there's talk of that happening, which begs the question, why are we having this major distraction of Rwanda? You know, there are so many issues that could be focused on, and this is a classic example of bread and circuses, a complete distraction from the real issues, which are essentially, why is the Home Office approving 74% of asylum applications? This is a scandal no one seems to be addressing. It's a far higher rate than in any other European country, several times higher than you get in France and Sweden, for example. Why aren't we processing enough applicants as well? You know, why are we making it more attractive to come here than to stay in France? There are so many other issues. Now, I'm on record as having said I favour the idea of offshore processing centres, just like the Australians had with Nauru, which is over 1,000 miles off the coast of Australia. I've always favoured the Ascension Islands as a place where you can absolutely process people, and then you send them back to where they've come from. You may have a deal with Rwanda for those people that can't be sent back home, but that's a very different issue. And those are where the solution should lie. Also getting the French to actually do what the Belgians do and intercept boats when they've just gone into the water. The French, for some reason, don't do that, and the Belgians have had huge success. We're paying them so much money. You know, they were very happy. If they won't do it, we'll do it for them and come over. Well, they were very happy to have our help at Dunkirk. We went and came over to save their chaps then.
I
think they owe us big time. They can do it now. So Rwanda is a major distraction. But what it actually has shown is that, you know, Suella Braverman was vilified even by her own party establishment. She was derided as being incompetent and unsuited for her position. And what the last 2 weeks have shown us is that she was actually right all along.
Yeah, right all along, but apparently, Patrick, you know, actually, when it came to it, she was quite ineffective. That's what I understood.
Well, I do hear that in the actual key meetings with senior civil servants, she was more of a mouse than a lion. People say that. On the other hand, if you have a prime minister who is not prepared to implement the policies you tell him are necessary, then you are going to fail. And I think there was a flavour of that with Priti Patel and Boris Johnson, is that he wouldn't really grasp the nettles. She made the mistake of over-claiming that she'd broken the business model of people smugglers when she hadn't. And, you know, if you overclaim and underdeliver 3 or 4 times in a row, your credibility goes. I don't think Suella Braverman overclaimed. She was clearly very frustrated underneath the surface. But I think she's, as Rafe was saying, she has been proven correct that the last act that we were told was going to sort this out wasn't tough enough. There weren't these notwithstanding clauses in it. And then equally on the issue of, let's not forget, legal immigration running at net almost 750,000 a year. 6 times she sent proposals to bring that down, warning Rishi Sunak it was running out of control. And again, he did nothing.
I mean, that's one of the most amazing things of this whole thing, is the way in which Rishi Sunak has only just discovered legal migration as being an issue. If you remember, his 5 pledges that he made were to, you know, halve inflation, reduce the debt, I forget what the other 2 were, and then stop the boats. Whereas he could have said reduce legal and illegal immigration. Legal immigration wasn't even on his priority list, whereas we know for a fact it's the greatest issue, or the second biggest issue, for voters. And we know full well that actually the average British voter is not only to the right of most MPs, they're to the right of all Tory MPs as well on the issue of immigration. And the fact that he should have fumbled the ball on this so dramatically, I think, speaks a lot to the mindset that exists within the Tory party establishment that is so disconnected with their voters.
Yes. And indeed, I think that's why Starmer feels so relaxed on Rwanda and Stop the Boats now, because Starmer is actually occupying ground on legal immigration to the right of the Conservatives. This man who stood for the Labour leadership as an open borders fanatic, he only has to get net migration down to 500,000 a year, and he can say, well, I've lowered it from what I inherited. It's ridiculous.
Well, there's this, apparently the new Conservatives group of MPs, their big kind of claim is we're going to get it down to 200,000. And you sort of think, 200,000? You know, the last poll, I think was this week, showed that 53% of people want, like, nada, zero migration now.
Yes.
So, you know, that's 53%.
Yeah.
And that's not, obviously with the Tory voters would be much more than that. I mean, you've written about this recently, Patrick. The people who would have supported this bill, not rebelled or not abstained as it was in the end, they are essentially these sort of one nation Tories. Is that right? I mean, that's what they call themselves?
Well, I think this is a new discovery. It certainly was to me that there are over 100, perhaps 106 Conservative MPs who are signed up to this One Nation caucus. That's even after the shakeout that Boris Johnson achieved over Brexit when he took the whip away and took candidates away, and people like Amber Rudd and Rory Stewart and Dominic Grieve and David Gauke all left. There's still more than 100 Conservative MPs who think this legislation goes too far, who won't hear a word of us rubbing up against our so-called international obligations. And it's not just on this issue, it's on the pace towards net zero, it's on tax and spend, it's on alternatives to custody rather than strong law and order. There's this blocking group of 100 plus Conservative MPs who will stop a Conservative regime doing anything Conservative. So the Conservative Party would have to win the next election by a majority of, say, 250 in order to get any Conservative legislation through. So what is the point of anyone voting for them, even if they were persuaded that Rishi Sunak has Conservative instincts himself?
I mean, One Nation actually is a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? That was a Disraelian thing. I mean, these people seem to be of this class of people who are not recognisably Tory in any way.
It's a one home counties party, I would say, rather than a one nation party, because of course it's a retreating to the blue wall and ignoring the seismic, almost once in a century shift we've seen in party allegiances that happened because of Brexit, where we now have small c, old-fashioned Labour working class voters coming over to the Tory party, lending their vote for that one election to see whether they'll be proved to have done that correctly. But yeah, you're quite right. The One Nation Tories are a force that have basically hampered any attempt to get true Conservative policies done, and it looks like they have, because there are a larger number of those MPs than there are from these so-called five families that Marc Francois loves to talk about so much, claiming that the media talk about it, although I've never heard them talk about it, just him telling us. But so it seems as if, for example, I think the Rwanda bill will go through as it is, simply because there are enough votes there on that side. And again, it's them hampering what the British people actually want. And we've seen it time and again on policy after policy.
I mean, when you think, actually, Patrick, when you were an MEP, UKIP MEP, during the referendum, the scale of betrayal is unbelievable, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it completely is. Some of it's down to Boris Johnson, who gets an easy ride. On immigration policy, it was Boris Johnson who took the brakes off. I mean, he is the one who authorised lower earnings thresholds, relaxation of student numbers and numbers of dependents that could come in. He gave a completely unqualified offer to the Hong Kong British National Overseas Passport holders. He didn't even go around New Zealand, Australia, Canada saying, look, can we do something collectively for them? He took the whole onus on the United Kingdom. Same again on Ukraine, uncapped numbers. It's no surprise, is it, that having promised overall numbers will come down, not only the opposite happened, but on the most unbelievable scale. And I think that's the biggest betrayal. And I actually think Boris Johnson could have ridden out the storms on, backbench sleaze, the storms on Partygate, if he'd held true to the voters who backed him wanting immigration to be lowered. There would have been a solid wall of support, and the polls wouldn't have ebbed away for Boris like they actually did.
It is quite extraordinary as well, isn't it? That, what is it now, 2019? Almost I think nearly to the week of the election, Boris Johnson election, and the level of opportunity that there was, which has come to zero, nothing, isn't it?
That's been the greatest tragedy and travesty of the last few years. If you think about it, when you have an 80-seat majority, this government should have been in power until 2029. Initially, easily could have been there till 2034. Actually, they could have been in power for 15 years just for this term. And you think about what Tony Blair was able to achieve in his 13 years of office. This country is a post-revolutionary society because of the reforms and the changes to our constitution and devolution and immigration, all brought in, and the long march through institutions of Blair. And we have wasted so much time when we could have tried to reverse that, and we would have had ample opportunity to actually hopefully reverse to the tide on so much of the damage that's been done to this country, and to see it thrown away, and to see it thrown away so cavalierly, to have seen no clear plan. Love him or loathe him, Dominic Cummings actually understood so many of the reforms and changes from the BBC to the civil service. He was plugged into the needs of the voters, and he had as his mouthpiece Boris Johnson, who was clearly not on side, but would basically do whatever he was told if it made him popular. And that was a wonderful pairing. And unfortunately, because of COVID and what happened and the antics of Carrie Antoinette, we saw an end to Dominic Cummings. And that was also, I think, the great tragedy, because since then, Boris Johnson was a puppet with no string master, and we've had no one since then who seems to have had any idea of what the Tory party's agenda for change really is. And every time Sunak's tried to reset, he's gone down in the polls.
What do you make of the way he's performed at this COVID inquiry, Sunak?
Well, I'm struggling with what they call cognitive dissonance about that, because it's the one thing he's done as Prime Minister that I actually felt an element of sympathy and even support for him. He was arguing just a basic case of you have to do a cost-benefit analysis on these measures, and the inquiry seems clearly to be set up to say we should have locked down harder, faster. And it's challenging not only Sunak but Johnson as well on things they could have done that, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps they should have done. But there's all sorts of other things that the scientists were urging them to do based on projections, which turned out to be completely pie in the sky and complete nonsense, which would have caused an even bigger hit to the economy, and even more hit to public morale, to mental health problems, to children falling behind at school. So the inquiry seems to me it's just a sort of left love-in with a public health kind of outlook and no balance whatsoever. So I actually thought Rishi Sunak did okay at the inquiry.
I think this COVID inquiry is clearly a whitewash designed to actually absolve from sin all of those involved in public health, all of the scientific base, and to put all of the blame essentially on the shoulders of the of politicians, and including in that, of course, contrarian scientists who actually held opposing viewpoints. And I wouldn't be surprised if they've already written their concluding report. I mean, what the purpose of an inquiry surely is to learn from past mistakes. And if we're unwilling to actually interrogate properly those people who advise the Prime Minister, the reverence with which we saw Valence and Whitty treated, compared to the terrible sort of prosecutorial style for Carl Hennigan, who was the Oxford University professor for evidence-based medicine, who was basically made to look as if he was a fool and an idiot, and it gave a real sense that this actually isn't an inquiry. This is a prosecution, actually, more than anything else.
How much is this whole thing going to cost? Do you know?
Well, hundreds of millions,
It's
the
just
COVID inquiry, absolutely.
Isn't
It's probably going to go past, was it the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which is the current record? I think that was 130 million. I think we're heading for multiples of that.
Terrible. You mentioned, Blairite institutional, the long march through the institutions. A few things have happened with the civil service this week, haven't they? Which is sort of actually a part of that. One which really is eye-catching is that senior civil servants have their pay connected to their sort of achievements with diversity and inclusion.
That's right. Well, for bonuses, to achieve bonuses, senior civil servants are examined not on the performance of their duties on its own, but on what they do outside of their job, including, for example, on the level to which they've promoted diversity, the EDI, this equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And of course, the whole point of bonuses is to reward service to your job, to do your job properly. It's about seeing, whether you can deliver projects ahead of time and below budget. And what this is doing essentially is it's completely removing that focus that should be on the job onto completely nebulous other areas. And there are £7 billion of public money is spent on diversity and inclusion programs. This was a report by the Conservative Way Forward think tank, from governments, quangos and government contractors. £7 billion, we could end homelessness overnight with that sort of money, and it's being spent on these terrible things where you have civil servants meeting together to discuss the trouble with whiteness, and to essentially, push all of these agendas and programs which have been shown to cause more division than anything else. And I think, it's about time that the Tories took hold of this. They have Esther McVey now appointed as this Minister for Common Sense, and apparently part of her remit is to come to terms with this. But this is in the dying embers of a Tory government. Where have they been for the past decade when this was taking place?
Terrible title. Why did they give them these titles?
Well, that's an unofficial title. That's not.
Yeah,
that's
I
not a
know,
real
but
title,
I mean, it's sort of, but also, what is she meant to be doing? Actually, what is it? An anti-woke thing, isn't it, or something like this? Anti-woke thing. But do you go along with the idea that the civil service, Patrick, is basically sort of that it should be replaced? I like this American idea that you basically bring in with you a civil service. Do you think that would be good for this country or not?
I do now. I'm quite regretful about that, because the British ideal of the impartial civil service was a good model, but we've reached a stage in our society of polarisation, and the cohort of people that the civil service draws from, sort of liberal, left, graduate class, all clustered in various affluent London villages, all thinking the same, all reading The Guardian, all hating the right. I do now think the case is overwhelming for newly elected administrations bringing in leadership groups for every Whitehall department and policy making groups. I think just having one or two special advisors fighting, 20 senior Sir Humphreys who are all leaning culturally left is a recipe for disaster. And again, we're seeing, as Rafe was saying, under a Conservative government, you have these EDI reward schemes. I mean, did the minister even know about that? Did the minister in the relevant department push back against it? It just seems there are so many examples of anti-Conservative things happening across the civil service under a Conservative government. I mean, it does make you worry what happens when the ministers who are brought in under Keir Starmer actively want to drive this agenda.
Yeah. I think actually, it makes you think that perhaps during the referendum campaign, for example, during that whole period, that perhaps many people, Brexiteers, underestimated quite what they'd be up against. Like the level of general sort of, opposition that there would be among this big slice of opposition, isn't there, unelected? And I just wonder whether people were as aware as they could have been.
Well, they certainly didn't expect it to be within the party that they voted for. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the left always say, well, you chaps have been in power for so long, you've only got yourselves to blame. Well, yeah, to an extent that's true. But of course, you may be in government, but you're not actually having an effect in the same way that councils are, that institutions are, that universities are, museums, galleries, the BBC, all of the institutions of state have been captured by this woke ideology. We've done nothing to reverse that. And they actually have, in many ways, a far bigger impact on the culture of the nation and on society and on the daily experience people have with the world around them. Now, one of the other policies announced this week on the civil service is that Jeremy Hunt said he wants to push ahead with bringing out senior civil servants out of London, which is great, because at the moment 2/3 of senior civil servants who are actually part of this Westminster bubble that Patrick was talking about live in London. And if you were going to send them to Aberdeen and Doncaster and elsewhere, you would actually bring in a different dynamic, because most of the senior civil servants will never want to leave their cosy suburbs, so they will resign from the civil service, which will provide an opportunity for people from the north of England and elsewhere to be brought in. Remember an episode of Yes, Prime Minister, where this was touted, and Sir Humphrey Appleby said, "Oh, it will never work because the wives of the civil servants, there's no Harrods or Wimbledon or Ascot in the north of England," and that's quite true. So I think you will have an actual cultural change in the senior civil service if those roles are sent up to other parts of England.
Well, yes, but this is all the argument always used by the BBC, isn't it? We're going to go here and going to go there, and it will change. But I mean, basically, the same people get kind of taken on, don't they? They get the same sort of attitudes always seem to emerge. It's made no difference to the BBC the fact that they're in wherever it is they are. Salford.
Yeah. I think the danger is you replace one metro hub with another. So it's Manchester or Leeds in the case of Channel 4 News. I sort of think the civil servants will wangle it that they're in Oxford, Cambridge, Brighton, Norwich, York, rather than Stoke-on-Trent and Nottingham and Worksop, Mansfield. If they could get them into proper red wall towns.
Well,
and
I think that is the plan. I think it's
locally.
Aberdeen, Doncaster. These are the places that are being touted. If they can be brought into those areas, and actually, as again we mentioned Dominic Cummings, I mean his plans for reforming the civil service merit a longer discussion than we have here. But excellent, bringing political advisors right into different civil service departments so that they're there physically to see what's going on, and actually recruiting people from different areas. Because the people that succeed in the civil service are those people who are careerists, who don't shake the boat, who actually don't think outside of the box, and they simply know how to promote themselves. Without actually bringing in radical change and radical ideas. And people who are excited about issues tend to leave for other areas because they're so frustrated by the apparatus of the civil service.
Do you share Ray's high opinion of Cummings?
Well, I certainly think that the Cummings-Johnson partnership from whenever he took over, July 2019, drove Brexit incredibly hard, and I give Boris Johnson and Cummings a lot of credit because they were soaking up enormous amounts of establishment abuse, whether it's legal circles, media circles, the massive House of Commons majority, which was really anti-Brexit, even to the point, though they didn't admit it, of thinking they could block it altogether. They didn't admit it until very late in the day with the idea of this so-called people's vote to overturn it, and that Johnson and Cummings sort of rescued our democracy. I do think that, only then to sort of throw it away shortly afterwards.
Speaking of red wall, blue wall, there's been some talk, it sounds like rubbish talk, but of a dream team between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, Nigel being back from the jungle this week. Is that just, just tittle-tattle? I mean, to me, it seems like it couldn't be a dream team when you look at what they both think on migration. One is huge liberal and one more hardline,
I mean, I think this side of the general election, I would be absolutely astonished if Nigel Farage were to get involved in the Conservative Party. And I think already since he come out of the jungle, you've heard the derision he has, and particularly on the issue of mass migration, legal mass migration, even above illegal migration. And I think you and me, Peter, also both know, I think that if Nigel gets involved in an enterprise, he usually envisages a leadership role for himself rather than being a junior minister to Rishi or Dave. So I think Nigel Farage, his political activity next year in 2024 will be all designed to beat the Conservative Party down to the lowest possible level, and only then after the election he may decide whether this is a cheap stock that is worth him buying into, or does he stick with reform and try and replace them altogether?
Because he's sort of on two horses at the moment, isn't he? Because on the one hand, he's saying, basically Tories need to be. Well, he's saying that actually who knows, I might join or whatever. And on the other hand, he's also president of a party that wants to obliterate the Tories. So in a way, he's.
But of course, the fact is, I mean, we were discussing before we went on air that, of course, if there was a general election, the very likely result is that the very people who would remain as Tory MPs are the ones who are most opposed to Nigel Farage, the One Nation Tories, people on the left of the Tory party. So the idea, I think, that there's any hope of Nigel Farage taking over a party or leading a party which is populated by people who despise him, I think is for the birds. I just can't see it happening. There'd have to be a schism within the Tory party, and he could only appeal to the ERG and others on the right. But I said a couple of years ago, when after Brexit, when Nigel retired from the Brexit party as it then was, he's sort of the canary in the coal mine. When there are big issues about to come, he will come back to politics when there is an issue that is as electric as Brexit. And I said at the time, an immigration party would be the actual way for Nigel to come back into power, but the time wasn't right because immigration wasn't then. The big topic is still becoming. I'm still not sure whether we're quite at that point yet, but we're certainly coming to the point where immigration does have the ability to revive the whole sort of UKIP Brexit atmosphere, and Nigel, of course, would be a logical person to
Don't you think those demonstrations that we've seen over the past month, that seems to have really opened quite a few people's eyes on this issue, on migration, not on Israel.
No, I completely agree. And again, Suella Braverman proven right on multiculturalism, having failed on a lack of integration. I accidentally stumbled into one of these marches, and I was quite surprised at the very, very high percentage of people who weren't British on it, from obviously North Africa and Middle East. I think some of them, quite a proportion, may have been overseas students at London universities. And then there was a sprinkling. Actually, most of the white people there were kind of young, liberal-minded women, but 80% were kind of full-on Islamist people who were making no effort to integrate with British values at all, didn't care about disrupting our capital city, and were saying hateful things about Israel. I think that there's been a massive sharp intake of breath across the country about what are we becoming, what is happening to our major cities.
I think with Matthew Goodwin said that any party, that any smaller party that wants to get on at the moment should talk about three things only: migration, migration, migration. Not education, but migration. We've been making plans for Nigel again, it seems, haven't we? And seeing what happens. Just one last thing, as a political columnist, Patrick, do you, looking at the tea leaves, do you think that the more interesting time to be looking at new things happening will be before an election or actually just after?
Well, I think it's going to be a very dynamic political year ahead running up to the election, because I still think the possibility of an absolutely massive Conservative meltdown has been underpriced. Getting on, worse than 1997, getting on towards the famous Canadian results, that if the socially conservative or just generally conservative electorate works out, there's no point in these guys. They not only have they betrayed us, but actually Sunak, Starmer, Hunt, Rachel Reeves, there's not a huge difference. It's not like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell waiting in the wings. So I think Starmer has kind of played a bit of a blinder by not scaring the horses. And I think that's enough to make a huge slug of Tory voters just sit on their hands on election day. And Nigel can galvanise another huge slug of them to come out and vote for reform. So I'm quite excited. I think it'll be an exciting run up to the election.
Yes, I think it seems that there have been sort of certain tectonic plates shifting. It's very, very hard, because sometimes you think actually the people have sort of woken up, but then you go out into the world outside London and you sort of think actually we've got a long way to go yet, actually. But anyway. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Rafe. And we shall see you next time. So in the meantime, have a good week, won't you? Bye.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.